Welcome everyone to our second seminar of this series, Researching Creative Economies in Africa and Sharing Knowledge, Methods and Practices, funded and supported by Circle U seed funding and part of the Africa-Europe Cluster of Research Excellence on Creative Economies. My name is Roberta Comunian. I'm a professor of creative economies at King's College London. And today I'm very pleased to chair this seminar on the evolution of the animation sector in Kenya. I will introduce our speakers in a minute, but I'm particularly grateful to them today because they represent very well what we want to achieve with the core, which is a genuine long-term collaboration between researchers in Europe and Africa, as well as a strong connection between academic research and creative workers and practitioners. I would like now to introduce you to Paula Callus, a professor at the National Center for Computer Animation, Faculty of Media and Communication at Bournemouth University, and Alfred Muchilwa, who studied design at the University of Nairobi in Kenya and is now Senior Art Director in Nairobi. Together, they will offer us a longitudinal reflection on the evolution of Kenyan animation landscape over the past 20 years, drawing from first-hand experience, case studies, and critical scholarship on African media studies, tracing the creative, political, and technological transformation that have shaped the field. Thanks, Paula and Alfred. The floor is yours.
You can see from the title of our presentation, it's 20 years later because me and Alfred have known each other for 20 years. And when I was a PhD student at SOAS, basically I got involved in doing research in Sub-Saharan Africa and specifically focusing on animation. And that's a little bit how me and Alfred's paths crossed and have been crossing, I think, in various different ways since then. So as you said, I'm a professor. I teach computer animation at Bournemouth, but really my own research expertise for the most part has been in Sub-Saharan African animation, specifically in certain countries, and more recently I've been looking a little bit in Nigeria, but my heart is always in Kenya, always go back. So yeah, Alfred, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
I'm Alfred Muchilwa, and I'm a senior art director working at an advertising agency currently, but like Paula said, we go way back. I got my start in animation in 2004, thanks to the UNESCO Africa animated workshops. And after that, I got to work on Kenya's first locally produced animated show for an international audience called Tinga Tinga Tales. And later on, I took the expertise that I gained from Tinga Tinga Tales and trained Rwandan animators at the Africa Digital Media Academy. So now I've sort of gone full circle and come back to Kenya. When I started, I was working in advertising, and then I wanted to make comic books, and I had the chance to learn animation and did something with it. And now I'm taking everything that I've learned and trying to apply it in advertising again.
Cool. So we wanted to start by really, I suppose, what was the beginning for myself and Alfred, which was this UNESCO project we were involved with a few years back, and specifically 20 years ago, that was set out in Kenya to look at really creating context or environment for African animation to come about. And that's my involvement on the project. Was I was invited as an educational consultant, where at the time we were looking at developing what would become a 5-week artist residency program, which people like Alfred were involved in. And this ran for a number of years in different places, so not just in Kenya. And it involved artists regional, but then also further afield. So, of course, for us, this presentation was about looking at 20 years after this project came about, how has animation moved from what at the time would have been like a handful of enthusiasts and artists to really producers operating in digital spaces and making their own content. So a good place to start is just to underpin some of the principles that UNESCO were working to, which then underpinned like the project and what we set out to do. So obviously they were looking at the idea of mobilizing education for every child, as this being like a human right and prerequisite, building intercultural understanding and the protection of culture and heritage, which is something as well we looked at in the project, and then also protecting freedom of expression. So I did put this in because obviously, as the project was started up by UNESCO, really a lot of the goals that were set out by the people who worked as consultants were underpinned by that. So our project goals were really to look at what the challenges and drivers were for local content creation. And we were looking at it, and initially we started like looking at it in a regional perspective. So we were looking at East Africa, but actually as the years went by, this again became bigger. And as I mentioned, it included different experts, academics, broadcasters, people from animation studios, although I should say those were very limited at the time, and independent artists. And what we wanted to achieve was a way to take artists who had no knowledge of animation and to be able to equip them with the skills that they needed to be able to create content that then could be broadcast on local television stations. And I say this because it's important to note that at the time we're talking about a context which is very pre-digital, right? So very pre-YouTube. I know it's hard to believe, but that time did exist. And that obviously meant that when we were looking at what kind of content we need to consider, for example, airing slots, and would a broadcaster broadcast a 5-minute animation? And if they wouldn't, how would we be able to group different animations together, and so on and so forth? So there were considerations that were very much attached to the technology and the context. And so some of the pictures you're seeing on the slides are examples of portfolio work that the artists would submit to us. So they would be collected, scanned, and then sent as an email to us for review. And we would then look at them and then, based on the submissions, decide which participants were going to be part of this 5-week residency program, one of which was Alfred. And that ties into...
I think you want to play the video by Celia.
Thank you, Alfred. I knew I was going to forget something. So I'm just going to share a video from some of the workshops just to give you a sense of kind of what the direction of travel was for us as trainers and educators. So Celia Sawadogo is an animator and also an educator herself from Canada. She's from Burkina Faso originally. And this was something she was sharing at the time in one of the workshops we ran in 2000.
Now, what's my screen? And I see they have black card, they have several characters. I would say, where's your black card? Where's your 40% of visible minority in Canada? You know, where is it? I want to see these people. I want to see them in the front. But I force them to actually be aware of it. These are little things that maybe, you know, are important or not important for you here. But I personally think that we all have a message to bring through. We're here because we want to do African film, African animation. We want to be part of the whole global side, you know? So for us, it's important to push that forward.
And I should say, like, you know, at the time, Celia was really prescient in her thinking because, you know, nowadays this is very kind of standard in animation and in filmmaking that these aspects are considered. And yet at the time, it was really unusual actually for people to talk about having Black characters in the foreground or to draw from local stories and local myths. And so for me, for example, I was just drawing on like Mweza, who talks about African art on this idea of the legacy of erasure, that if it's not visible and if it's not seen, it sort of ceases to exist. And that's what underpinned my own research interest in Sub-Saharan African animation, that there was a lot, that there were things going on, that there were people making things, but because it wasn't being spoken about, because it wasn't being documented, then, if you like, the question, does African animation even exist, was something we were often faced with. And so our project was a response to that, but also my research was a response to that. And then on the right, you can see this is just the list of Kenyan participants that took part in the Africa animated projects. And then what we're going to do in this presentation is sort of track, if you like, some of their careers and trajectories and look at how from and off the back of this project, different things have happened in the Kenyan animation landscape. Alfred, I don't know if I've forgotten anything, but I'm assuming you're going to keep me straight if I did.
No, you're doing fine.
Okay. Cool. So these are just some pictures of like, just to give you a sense of like what the project was like. I don't want to dwell on it too much because I'm aware we've got a lot of content to get through, but it's also just pointing to like the technologies we were using. So just to have that in the back of your mind. So you can see we even constructed like portable light boxes, which meant that people could do their frame by frame drawing, you know, in their rooms, or to take it home with them and then use it with us. But of course, the bigger point is that we weren't using graphics tablets, right? So everything was being hand drawn and then scanned in and so on and so forth. And then obviously those technologies and the technological landscape changed. Also, just to point out a couple of key figures here who weren't Kenyan, but Mohammed Ghazala, for example, in the picture on the left, is an Egyptian animator who has gone on to set up the organization called ASIFA, which is the International Animated Film Association. And then also over here is Serge Petropia, and he's from Burkina Faso. And then he went off back to Burkina Faso and has subsequently set up the Association of Animation Artists in Burkina Faso. So I feel like this project, like, although we're talking about Kenya, it also had really far reach and impact in other places. So to go back to this idea of the legacy of erasure and how we were trying to make sure that we were championing local artistic practices, which was really firmly embedded in the ethos of the project, I just wanted to show you some examples of how we were introducing different artist work, but also artistic traditions from various sub-Saharan African countries as inspiration for the animators to go off and develop their own work. And Alfred will talk a little bit about that in the context of the film that he made. But these are just some other examples that I just wanted to illustrate. So on the left, for example, we looked at Orthodox Christian Ethiopian murals, and then we sort of looked at their format, but also their style, and then that became the basis for some of the character development on one of the animated shorts. To when we were in South Africa, we were looking at Ndebele dolls and Ndebele murals and architecture, and then again that became very much the basis for one of the stories we created in stop motion. And similarly, we were looking at, for example, a Congolese mask became the underpinnings for the design of one of the characters, and also the kanga. So I'm going to show you another little clip from the workshops, so you can see us talking a little bit about that. And so this is Shai, and she was a Kenyan storyteller.
He wants to pass to people. And the other lesson is, what are things that might just come out? Now, I briefly said that yesterday, but I also want to suggest to you that some of the things that might just slip in, some of the things that you might say, I'm putting in there, maybe the children you're working with don't know yet. So one of your agendas might be, I'm working with Kenyan kids who are going to be based in Nairobi, who know nothing about the significance of the writings on canvas, okay? I always laugh when I go to my friends who have grown up in non-coastal cultures. Because when we go to buy canvas, everybody is like, wow, it looks so beautiful. And my first question is, what do the words say? Because I'd rather have an ugly kanga, quote unquote, with good words, than buy my mother a kanga that ends up being an insult.
Yeah, so that just gives you an idea of the importance that we placed on looking very specifically at local meanings, local traditions, practices. So not just through storytelling, but also through all of the visual cultures that all of the artists and participants were bringing with them. So Alfred is going to talk a little bit about Toto's Journey, which is one of the films which was made on the project. Alfred.
So Toto's Journey was the film that I made for the second animation workshop. I participated in 2 of these, and the way I came up with the idea was I was in conversation with a Zimbabwean animator, and we were looking at this painting on a wall, that featured an African girl with a pot on her head and a landscape in front of her. So it seemed like she had this journey to go. And we sort of came up with a story about this child who goes through so much trials and tribulations, doing something simple like just carrying water home. But as we went through the workshop and went through different iterations, we came up with the idea of why they were doing all this, which was to irrigate a plant at the end, or irrigate a farm. And as we were going through the design process, normally you start by, it's a film, so it's sequential art. So you start by mapping out the sequence of images as they're going to appear on screen, which is what you're seeing in the background on that slide. And then you go to the design process. And as we got to the design process, initially I just wanted it to be a boy. But then this being Africa animated, and after conversation with Paula and the other instructors, we realized that we needed to draw from that African culture, exactly what she's just been talking about. And we found that by converting the boy into a fertility symbol, like converting his head into a West African fertility symbol, it added an additional layer of meaning to the story. So we took that and changed the design of the boy. If you look at some of the other characters, they remain plain as it was, as silhouette kind of with African clothing. And it just added this layer of meaning on top of the animation that we originally intended, that made this particular animation successful. And it was screened in several festivals across the world, including the Hiroshima Animation Festival in 2008.
Yeah. So I have a short clip, which as well of the film, which we can play. And I'll just. No, we've been having some problems with the sound, so I hope you're able to hear this.
Hi, Paula, there is no sound, but I think it's effective.
Yeah, me and Alfred had this problem only with this animation.
It is fine. I mean, it's still nice without sound.
It's on YouTube, so
yeah, maybe we can share the link afterwards. Thank you.
I'll share the chat. Share the link in the chat. Strangely, it's only that one, but there you go. Okay, so that leads us on to talking a little bit about Tiger Aspect's animated series called Tinga Tinga Tales, which you might may or may not be familiar with. So we preluded all this about talking about how we really wanted to look at culturally located aesthetic devices, and a lot of the work we did in African animated projects with UNESCO was really emphasizing that. And I feel like Tinga Tinga Tales is one of these examples in sort of the context of the animated creative industries in Kenya, which was a really pivotal moment. And it did use culturally located devices, and yet there were quite a few polemics around the production of this series. So you may or may not be familiar with it because it has been screened in the UK and it's had an international audience. And it was basically set up by Tiger Aspect Limited, which is a company based in London. So 3 years after the Africa Animated project had finished, the producer, Claudia Lloyd, who was responsible for like animations like Mr. Bean and Charlie and Lola, visited Kenya and Tanzania, and basically she was really, let's say, impressed or enamored by these paintings, which are called Tinga Tinga paintings. So you can see on the bottom right of the slide is an example of a Tinga Tinga art, which was made by a cooperative of artists in Tanzania, well, Alfred can explain a little bit more about that, but I believe they were all trained by one artist Is that correct?
Yeah. So the Tinga
Oh, Alfred, we've lost
style
you.
is literally named after a person named Edward Saidi Tinga Tinga.
Okay,
Can you
great.
hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So the Tinga Tinga is literally a style of painting named after one person, Edward Saidi Tinga Tinga, who I think he passed away in the early 70s. But he found some level of success while he was still alive. And then he trained several people from his community in the same style. And progressively, as you go through the decades, it iteratively became this characteristic, very distinct style of painting. And the artists themselves formed a cooperative in Tanzania. So when Claudia wanted to do the production, she went to the cooperative and made a one-off payment and hired some of the artists as work for hire, brought them to Nairobi, and we're sort of getting into the production process, but she would use them in the ideation stage. So if you wanted to find what a zebra looked like in the Tinga Tinga style, you'd get the Tinga Tinga artist to paint it, and then she'd work with Kenyan designers to digitize that style and translate it into something that could be aired on TV internationally, for Disney.
Yeah,
So
and
that's where the conflict came from.
correct.
Sorry.
And around that, I guess I would add is obviously, anyway, for anyone that is familiar with animation studies discourse, there is like long-standing histories of, you know, animation companies from the West appropriating stories as their own and profiteering off that. So in and around, if you like, that context, this polemic sort of arises around like who owns the Tinga Tinga style. And in addition to that, not just simply on a sort of a West on the rest kind of context, but also within the region itself, because oftentimes the animation was being referred to as a Kenyan animation, which for all intents and purposes was correct in the sense that it was being made by a studio with Kenyan animators. But of course, the artistic style was came from a cooperative of artists in Tanzania. So I think that also didn't help. I mean, I think Alfred might agree with that. So,
Yes.
so we just wanted to point to that because although it's like a really important moment in the creative sector in Kenya, because actually it was like a really large studio. The scale and the ambition of the project was, I think, a first for its kind. And it employed a lot of people who were involved on the Africa Animated project. So Celeste, for example, and Alan and Tom, they were all participants on the Africa Animated project. So they already had the training in animation that, was needed, if you like, to be able to go into the production. So I don't know, Alfred, if you want to talk a little bit about the mechanisms of the context and what kind of facilitated all of that in terms of the production.
I mean, when Claudia came, she had a conversation with Gado and they needed to source artists. That's me on the left slide, on the left part of the slide. That was my desk. But so she had a conversation with Gado, and then Gado brought in a whole bunch of artists who, many of whom were on Africa Animated. And she interviewed, and we did a pilot in 2006 with mostly Africa Animated artists. And then in 2008, they got funding, and then they came back in 2008. And then she had some of the artists, including myself. And we went through the production. So literally, it was a team of about 30 people in one building working on this. And it was a fully localized production. So there are several conditions that had to be met for this production to be able to take place. And some of them get into the political arena. The government at the time instituted a policy where they zero-rated import duties on all computer and film equipment, and that made it easier to for local designers and design studios and animators and filmmakers to bring in equipment at an affordable rate. Previously, you'd be paying twice or thrice the price. And then secondly, they in collaboration with several other governments, improved the internet by bringing in an undersea cable, actually two of them, one from the UAE and the other one from Southern Africa. And what this did was it resulted in a sudden explosion of internet usage locally. But also importantly, it made it possible to host this kind of production because you're sending files back and forth between Nairobi and London. And these files are usually massive.
Yeah. And I think those factors are really important to bear in mind, because for us as well, we were looking at like the context and how the technological context changes, and alongside those changes, things are made possible, and also practices around animation change as a response. So we did say there was a lot to cover, and we're aware of the fact that we might run out of time. So in the interest of like timekeeping, what we've tried to do is group some of the examples of work that we've looked at into what we see as themes that have emerged, that were obviously connected to the social and political contexts in Kenya, as well as technological context. So we've decided to settle on like four main themes. One where we're going to look at examples of political or subversive satirical work. Another theme where we'll look at children's animation, and then we'll look at interactive animation, and also commercial and NGO animation. So some of the pictures you're going to see on the screen, if you want us to talk a little bit more about them, we can do so later. We won't necessarily be able to cover every one in great detail, but hopefully in the Q&As we'll be able to go through that. So you can see there's like a robot transformer-like figure. That was a political animation that was made after the election violence in 2007. So I wanted to sort of pick up there by beginning to talk a little bit about the XYZ show, which you might be familiar with. It's a satirical TV show which is based on kind of like Spitting Image, or Le Guignol if you're French. You might be familiar with it. It works with puppets, and it was developed by Gado. So Gado was also one of the participants on the Africa Animator project, but he's a political cartoonist. He has he's very, very famous political cartoonist in Kenya, and very successful. So the XYZ show takes caricature and comedy and uses it for political critique. And I've written about this and sort of speculated on how Gado and his work created a climate which encouraged and facilitated other animators to create political content. I mean, we can't talk about all of it, but yesterday me and Alfred were reminiscing on someone who Alfred worked with, who was even making his own DVDs with political animations and selling them at the local markets. And although when you look at like Spitting Image, or in this case, the XYZ show, you wouldn't necessarily classify it as animation. A lot of the aesthetic tropes come from like cartooning, which of course has a strong alignment to animation. And also the techniques that Gado was using to manufacture the puppets are quite similar to what one would do in stop motion animation.
Interesting anecdote, when Gado, he also did a pilot for the XYZ show in 2006, and it was animated. So we actually did that after doing the Tinga Tinga Tales pilot. But the decision was eventually made to go with the puppets.
Great. And then there's Makarao TV, which Alfred can talk a little bit about.
So Makarao TV is about a pair of Kenyan policemen, and the Kenyans' relationship with the police is, I wouldn't say unique, but it's a little bit interesting in that there's a lot in terms of the relationship to authority and how the police view the public and vice versa. So this is a hugely successful show about a pair of policemen running around and harassing or in the name of protecting the general public. And it consists of 1 to 5 minute short films. Primarily on the YouTube platform is where it found its success. So this goes back to the undersea cable and how it made this sort of thing possible, where you have probably a team of 1, 2, or 3 animators working together and creating a series that is accessible by millions all of a sudden. and is still ongoing. And they managed to amass about 200,000 subscribers to this date.
Yeah, and obviously, as you can appreciate, different to what Gado was faced with, which at the time he was looking at trying to get it on local television stations. But in fact, he did eventually take it to a digital streaming platform as well. So those are like two examples of politics, let's say with a capital P. So dealing with like, you know, elections or ministers or local celebrities. But we wanted as well to focus on artists who are looking at maybe more politics of the personal, let's say, and the politics of identity. And Ngendo Muki is a Kenyan animator who has been very successful in international festivals around the world, and has tackled, well, a lot of her animation tackles social themed work, such as, for example, skin bleaching. So in Yellow Fever, she made an animated documentary, which is about herself and her sister and her mother and conversations they have around identity and skin lightening products. And then later on, she's made films like This Migrant Business, which is about migration, but also other personal stories with her mother again, called Keshopia Nisiku, and that was about her mother setting up a business on her own and looking again the politics of gender and gender identity in Kenya. So I just wanted to point you to her. You can view her work online. It's accessible. There's loads of articles, and also she's an amazing public speaker. So if you are interested in her work, she's given a few TED Talks, which you can watch on YouTube. And she's also one of these animators who came again from a background of working in children's animation. So she worked with Media IA, and they had done a animated series, which was very similar actually to Tinga Tinga Tales, which was looking at local stories with animals using, I think it was cutout animation. And now more recently, she's gone to work on Disney's Kizazi Moto, which I think we'll hopefully get to at the end. So that takes us to like a little bit more of the recent political work, looking at AI and activism. I think it would be really kind of amiss if we didn't mention AI and how it's changing the sector, because of course, now we're looking at like a non-expert use of content creation, which is being put out there, which is great, like a massive advantage. But also it's very different to what, let's say, the animation that myself and Alfred might have been trained on making. So it does a different thing. That said, in Kenya, Alfred will talk a little bit about this. There's been lots of evidence of activism using AI and using AI tools. And also there's an article by Mina that I'm citing here, which if you like, again, it's in my references at the end, which talks about how AI was used to empower activists. Alfred, did you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yes, and I was thinking about how the government, in terms of communication, the previously it used to be that the government would broadcast on TV using mainstream media and use the papers, and it was very one-sided. I mean, if you needed to respond to something that the government was doing, you'd either have to write a letter or call in, and it wasn't as effective as social media. So with the explosion of social media and with the recent explosion of AI, we are seeing younger Kenyans utilize these tools to speak truth to power. So the slide you're seeing there is of a politician addressing the local public. And if we can look at some of the clips.
Yep, going to do that.
So it's the Gen Zs that have taken up these tools.
Sorry,
and
we did have other clips, but we'll screen them at the end if we've got time.
Oh, okay. So what you're seeing there is we had protests over a finance bill in 2024, and a lot of youth came out on the streets, and not just the youth, but also older generations as well. And the protest achieved a lot. They managed to revise the finance bill, but a lot of lives were lost. And as part of the run up to the commemoration of those protests on the 25th of June. We have activists like Cyprian Nyakundi and some TikTok creators creating clips of famous statues in Nairobi coming to life and joining the protests. And this was created just to bring people out on the 25th of June 2025. And then I think we have another clip somewhere.
Yep.
Okay, so this is in Kiswahili, so you wouldn't understand it, but this is addressing our relationship to authority as Kenyans. So normally the authority wants you to fear them, but here you're seeing a local news reporter, of course through AI, instead of being scared of the tear gas, inhaling the tear gas and getting high. So it's partly a coping mechanism on Kenyans' part, but it's also, again, speaking truth to power. And then on the right there's a politician who came out and said, gave a shoot to kill, well, initially gave a shoot to kill order, but then revised it and said, no, don't kill them, shoot them in the leg. And the Kenyans came up with this thing called the one-legged movement, and someone took that and fed it into one of the AI platforms and came up with that clip. So we're seeing how AI, and in terms of the nature of broadcast, because the traditional broadcast is one-to-many, but then with social media, you have many-to-many. Getting engaged in activism, including Kenyans who wouldn't normally engage in activism. Because in the past it was, if you're out on the streets as an individual or as a small group, you'd be arrested. But then these days, there's some layer of anonymity that's provided by the internet.
And then other sort of things that myself and Alfred spoke about briefly was just thinking about how AI as a technology has changed the landscape and, you know, what its limitations are in terms of its ability to, for example, retain continuity, which currently it struggles with, and therefore it's much better suited at short formats. Alfred mentioned as well, it's very costly for video, so the compute kind of cost of getting the video clips, it could be an inhibitor, and therefore in a sense it's often being used in short media, and therefore social media formats are really a great platform. It's not quite the same thing as watching a 10-minute animated film yet. Of course, with AI everything can change. So that leads us to our next theme, where we're looking at children's animation. Again, we wanted to pick some examples, maybe not, I'm aware of the time, not dwell on it too much, but some examples of animations that have been a little bit different in the sense that they also, yeah, sorry, Alfred.
No, go ahead. It's okay.
They wanted to just align with the same ethos, I think, that, like, you know, we set out with at the beginning, making sure that, you know, they're creating content really for local audiences. But I mean, Alfred knows more specifically about this example.
So Uli and Tata's African Nursery Rhymes was created by a biracial couple, one from Kenya called Chief Nyamwaya, and Sarah Malia is from Malta. And I call it a product of love. So they got married and had kids and ran into this problem where they wanted to show their children the Kenyan culture and teach them nursery rhymes, but they couldn't find material that was readily available and definitely not packaged. So they decided to solve that problem using this series called Uli and Tata's African Nursery Rhymes. And what I like about their approach is they were heavily focused on the research. They went around the country, found out about, we have 44 communities in the country, found out about nursery rhymes in each community, and then made recordings of these songs and nursery rhymes and got famous performers to record these for the series. So that's what I like about this particular series.
And also it's an example of an animation that's done very well outside of Kenya as well. So it's gone to Annecy and it's attracted a lot of attention outside of Kenya. I don't know if that's what you were going to say, Alfred.
Yes.
And similarly, like the Legend of Luanda Magare, which was created by Kwame Nyong'o, who we'll talk a little bit more about as well when we look at NGO animation. So Kwame was also a participant on the project and went off, making work for commercials, but also he did work like this, where similarly he went to a community, researched different legends and different stories, and then developed that and worked with the community to develop the story. So when he finished his animation, he took it back to the community. And me and Alfred had a little chuckle because it also got shown at Glastonbury. So it's again one of these animations that has grown legs and been shown in loads of different places. So with interactive animation, it was always a strange one because typically when you talk of animation, you think of animation as in only, first of all, belonging to children, so children's format. And you don't tend to think about its applications in other fields. And of course, with computer animation, the crossover is more and more visible and evident in gaming, both aesthetically, but also because the technologies you're using, the software you're using is the same. So Andrew Kagia has like famously created the first sort of 3D person shooter video game that takes place in Nairobi. And I was saying to Alfred that when I interviewed him about this, he made a really interesting remark about how when he thought about the premise for this game, which is an alien or aliens attacking Nairobi, right? He had asked himself why do aliens never come to Africa, I think is the question he said. And it kind of made me think about, again, these conceptions that we have about Africa and why perhaps science fiction as a genre doesn't find itself in an African space, which is what Andrew Kagia was pointing towards when he made this game. But there are loads of other games you can see, like with Kugu Samal. I mean, that was really popular on mobile phone. And again, related very much to the context. So like now, as Alfred mentioned, everybody has a mobile phone. A lot of the watching and the interaction happens often through a mobile phone. And so there were a lot of things in the creative sector that were kind of orbiting around that, including companies like Letty Arts, who developed like, so this was like a Pan-African kind of cooperative of artists that were creating like comic book series with African heroes. And then you could interact with the series by watching it on your mobile phone. And I think they had like a little fight sequence where you could play different characters as well. And then finally, I think we end up with like commercial animation and just NGOs. And Alfred, you could talk a little bit about Fatboy.
Yes. So Fatboy was introduced he joined the Tinker Tinker studio a little bit later than the other animators, and he was introduced by Celeste, who was part of Africa Animated. And as he was going through the training, he was developing 3D skills on the side and creating a demo reel. So by the time we're approaching the end of the project, he had landed a major telco as a client, and he took that and he ran with it. But what makes his animation so endearing is their relatability, and not just in terms of design, but also in terms of voice and some of the voice casting that he does. So on the bottom right, you're seeing one of the characters that he's created called Kapinto. And this is a hugely popular character on YouTube and especially TikTok and Instagram as well. And you're seeing some of the African influence, like inspired influence in the design, in the visual design of the character. But when the character speaks, he has a particular intonation that's particular to Nairobi. That these are characters that you feel like you'd have met. Yeah, so that's Fatboy.
And then the last example I think we want to talk a little bit about was Apes in Space, that was set up by Kwame Nyong'o. So Kwame Nyong'o was also part of the Africa Animated participant and trainer. And he went off and basically set up his own company that was a studio that, for the most part, produced promotional films for different NGOs. And, I was speculating whether, you know, because Kwame had worked for a long time with UNESCO on the Africa animated projects, I wonder whether then he sort of found that niche and continued working for that sector and creating content for that sector. Of course, there's always the question when you're looking at animations that are created for the NGOs, that it's limiting to a degree, because it oftentimes tends to be didactic in its format. It tends to want to be educational. And when I was doing my field work in Kenya, I mean, a lot of the animators would complain about how there was work if you wanted to do work in the NGO sector, but it was creatively quite limiting, right? So what you were and weren't able to do, what stories you were and weren't able to tell. So it's interesting as well that it perhaps is a genre in its own right, you know, and something I was thinking about whether, you know, NGO animation is a thing, because it definitely, like in the, I don't know, Alfred, what do you think?
It is. I just wanted to add that definitely in terms of voice, what I've seen over the years is an evolution in terms of how these films are speaking to the general public, because initially it was very much a condescending, oh, this is how you should run your life kind of thing. Whereas I think as people like Kwame get involved and others, it's become more conversational in terms of tone. So if you ever stumble upon one of these clips that I think we have links to, you'll see that it's more relatable for the average Kenyan than it was previously.
Cool. So we wanted to end with just pointing you towards like other sort of contextual information that is relevant and connected to creative sector in Kenya. Kwame and others were largely involved with the Association of Animation Artists. We always used to have a laugh about that, which was founded in 2006 and really has been actively working with the government to look at policies. I can give you an example. I mean, I know South Africa did the same in terms of looking at the Film Commission and, for example, tax incentives for animation studios and whatnot. So a lot of lobbying around the sector to make sure that animation had an even footing to film, for example, which at the time, many years ago, it didn't. So I don't know, Alfred, I mean, I know you were a little bit involved with.
Yes. So in terms of promoting the cause of Kenyan animators and advocacy, both locally and internationally, the Association of Animation Artists and like the Kenya government set up the Kenya Film Commission, I think maybe 10 years ago. So they've been working in tandem since then to promote the cause of Kenyan animators, both locally and abroad. So they organize training, and from time to time, I think when there's a Kenyan expo overseas, they make sure that there's a film and animation contingent that goes along.
And then the other resource we wanted to point you to was the website African Digital Art, which was set up by a Kenyan woman called Jeb Chumba. Initially it was set up as a blog. I mean, I used to blog as well, so I remember it was at the same time we used to exchange content. And it's really developed into this amazing platform, which is showcasing digital work. It's got a fantastic search engine, so you can look by country, you can look by theme, by medium, and so on and so forth. And it covers like a range of material. It includes illustration, animation, cartoons, concept design, some fine art, some video work. But for the most part, it started from the creatives that I think orbit around animation. Because the thing is, with animation, it's just one of those practices that draws from a whole bunch of other art, right? So you could be an illustrator and you could be an animator. You can be a cartoonist and you can be an animator. You could be a filmmaker and you could be an animator. So that's sort of the great thing about animation. And we wanted to end with a few questions and reflections on really the context now and how artists have adapted to these changing platforms, how audience expectations and funding models might have changed from 20 years ago. And also, I think for me, one of the most noticeable differences is that, 20 years ago, when I would say to people, I'm researching African animation, this wasn't even on anybody's radar. It was like, I don't even know what that means. Now we've got Disney and Netflix, streaming content that is really being not only designed, made, directed by Sub-Saharan African artists. So in Kizazi Moto, for example, which was by Disney, Ingendo Muki was one of the directors on one of the episodes and has subsequently gone on to win a whole bunch of awards. And also, of course, as we've mentioned, AI. But Alfred, I'd like you maybe to end on a few reflections, because you've been there and all around, now out in Rwanda, back. So, yeah.
Now, I mean, to pick up, I think you're talking about, so 20 years ago, I went for the International Chick Film Festival in Stuttgart in Germany, thanks to Toto's Journey. And when I went there, I think I was being treated like an artifact. Like every time I would come across these animators that look at me like, what? You actually exist? And it goes back to the questions that you asked at the beginning of this presentation, Yeah, so in terms of adaptation and funding models, I think I'm seeing it's hit and miss. I think the younger generation, I think it's always the younger generation who are driving things. They're a little bit more enterprising and courageous. So I see a lot of young creators on TikTok and Instagram trying out different things and trying out different funding models. But in terms of support, I'm also seeing some support coming in from the likes of Alliance Française, for example, creating spaces where filmmakers and animators can come in and create animation. And I'm also seeing several funds like Hivos, for example, creating funds for creators, making available funds for creators to be able to pursue their projects. So that's encouraging. So that's what I'd have to say about that.
And then our last slide is just basically, again, I mean, I think it's just to illustrate the difference where we started off with maybe more than a handful of Kenyan animators, and now, there are more than 40 studios, 5 training institutions, and many, 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 many more artists. Unfortunately, we weren't able in the time we had to cover everyone, but I'm sure myself and Alfred would be happy to talk to anyone who'd be interested in finding more about Kenyan animation. And thank you for listening.
Thank you.